All right, here we go. The second lesson, Cold War, Politics and Society. What are some of the characteristics and issues going on there with our Mr. Harry Truman? The buck stops here, Harry. One of the things that is changing here is a reordering of the presidential succession and or line of succession here. You can see it in its entirety off to the right. It is based off of essentially the date in which most of the cabinet positions have been created by Congress, but of course it's still the vice president and the Speaker of the House of Representatives after that. There's just a reordering and an adding of people here that hadn't been there for a little while. The President Pro Tempore is number 3 and Secretary of State is number 4. This is more of a concern, again, with our time period that we're in, our Cold War. Should the president die and the vice president die at the same time, what would happen? This becomes essentially very important when it comes to the Soviet Union having the atomic bomb also and the advent of the possibility of a full-blown nuclear war. Our amendments grow here in 1951. The FDR amendment is added that officially sets the 2-term limit for the presidency. You can have 1 term, 4 years, if you've previously served more than 2 years of another president's term, right? So a maximum of 8 is what it actually establishes here. One of the things to consider here, the context of how Americans think in elected office and otherwise, just in regular everyday life, there is a consensus here, and it's going to be known as the vital center. Our political parties are less polarized than they had been before. Liberals, conservatives tend to agree on some key things. One, containment of communism, anti-communism was a focus and important for everybody. The economy was incredibly important as well. Having gone through the Great Depression, stability is essential, economic growth is essential, and they tended to be much more bipartisan in trying to come up with solutions to economic problems. Not that there won't be conflict, but they tended to be, and we tended to be more pluralistic, coexisting. For example, Democrats and Republicans largely will agree that New Deal programs are essential. The funding of them and the growing of them is going to be debated yet, but they were accepted, right? Social Security tended to be accepted by the conservative side and some of those other programs and checks and balances, but of course there's going to be a few limitations here and there. Now, this isn't the same coexist that we are thinking of probably today. There is a strong element of conformity here. It is limited coexistence in terms of cultural plurality. That's not necessarily completely there. You still need to be a good American, and that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit later. Notice the chart off to the right-hand side in terms of less polarization in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, and gradually over time it starts to change after that. So everybody's concerned about another Great Depression. The government needs to do what it needs to do to control inflation, make sure there are jobs, so on and so forth. There had been a removal of wartime price controls after the war, but Americans have a huge amount of money that they have built up during the wartime. They couldn't buy consumer goods and things of that nature, and so there is going to be this flood of spending, and so there is going to be some inflation, and that inflation outstrips the ability of people to pay for it in a few cases for a short period of time. And because of that, there are going to be a significant number of strikes going on throughout the country. Now remember that the New Deal protected these unions and their right to strike. But at the same time, they're very concerned that there's a radical element in the country, and unions are still seen more on that radical side of the spectrum here yet. So what is this all about for the extreme conservative side of the political spectrum? There's a concern here, and in 1946, Republicans gained control of Congress temporarily, and they passed an act called the Taft-Hartley Act. It basically said there has to be an 80-day cooling off period before there is a strike. If a strike is going to be declared or planned, there has to be 80 days of cooling off and maybe more negotiations before it actually happens. They just can't roll right into a strike. It outlaws the closed shop, right? The workshop, the factory workshop, and a closed shop, a shop that is closed and only for union members only to have a job there, is not okay in their mindset, right? It supported a union condition in a union shop, which meant that if a person gets hired, they don't have to be a member of the union first. They can be non-union, get hired, but then it's okay to be required to join a union or be a part of that union after they're hired. So it wasn't a prerequisite to get the job. It is only on the other side of things. And this was a bit of a check on the power of unions. Mr. Truman was against it and felt that it limited their ability to negotiate and to get what they needed done in representing their workers. But it's vetoed by him, but Congress overrides it fairly easily. Unions, though, still flourish during this time. There is a new kind of a federation of labor that was formed in 1935 in the midst of the Depression. It was called the Congress of Industrial Workers. And again, it is just a body of representatives representing different mini unions like the AFL was in 1886, and they will merge in 1955 to form one massive union, the AFL-CIO, which is still around here yet today. Craft and industrial workers, again, multiple mini subsets of unions that they will organize and try to coordinate efforts to improve worker pay conditions, so on and so forth. Now, there is in all of this a response to these unions as well. In many states throughout the late 1940s into the 1950s, there is the development of what you see here on the left, the development of right to work laws, which basically means that in order to have a job, you don't have to be a member of a union. You have a right to work. Being a union member should not be something that, or not being a union member should not be something that eliminates you from the opportunity to get a job. And so that tends to be something that is more dominant throughout the South. And notice that that map on the left tends to very much reflect the map on the recent electoral maps, presidential electoral maps, Republican, less regulation, not so much pro-union as the Democrats are. Right. Our society is very affluent. There is a doubling of the national income nearly. It almost doubles again in the 1960s. The United States has 40% of the world's wealth, with only about 6% of the world's population. 60% of Americans by the mid-1950s will own their own home. Forgive the spelling there. Add that E, please. Compared to 40% in the 1920s. And that's going to mean that there is a huge amount of buying of stuff to fill that home and to maintain that home. Consumerism is going to explode to heights never seen before, and there is a developing middle class in the 1950s that we have never seen before either in world history. There are some key factors behind all this. American standard of living doubles mostly because of the defense industry and the growth of the defense industry. We'll be talking a little bit later about the military-industrial complex. It's over 50% of the national budget. Defending against communism, right, is really the thing here. We're not in a war, although we're in and out of wars. The Korean War is going to keep that economy going here as well, but also the defense of other parts of the world against communism. Energy is very cheap. Oil is super cheap. Electricity production, therefore, is very cheap. We're rebuilding Europe, and the Marshall Plan is a factor here, as we talked about before. There's also a massive influx of people who are now more highly educated than ever before, and new technologies coming out of the war are going to increase productivity, as well as newfangled things in the home, i.e., for example, that thing called the television is going to be a big consumer item right off the bat in 1950. The other factor here is that there is an explosion of babies, right? GIs coming back from the war, getting married, they're having kids, and it is a situation where you need new homes, you need all those things that kids need. You have basically a economy that is going to market to kids toys and things that kids want in huge numbers, and they're going to have a huge impact on the politics and the economy of the future. And this is going to spur more growth as well. Imagine the number of schools that are necessary here for this education system, and colleges will grow with that as well. Another factor in the economic growth here, the post-war time period, is something called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. The federal government was much more ready for the return of millions and many more millions of soldiers coming back from the World War. GI stands for government issue. And this particular program makes sure that these soldiers have loans, cheap loans to go back to school, start a new business, buy a house, you name it. It's going to reduce unemployment. It's going to allow them to move back into the economy gradually, and it's going to boost the economy for the next several decades to come, right? More highly educated, more trained people means more money. That is a proven fact. Get out there and get your training and degrees, although it seems like it takes a little more degrees and a few more degrees than it has in the past to make that same amount of money. Truman has a political struggle, though, at home. There is a bit of a growth of resistance to New Deal type Democratic programs. His program is going to be called the Fair Deal, and Republicans controlling Congress in 1946 are going to fight him strongly on that. It's nothing but graft and waste and all that kind of thing, corruption. They would compare it to perhaps the political machines of the 19th century that we've talked about before. But he's going to push to raise minimum wage. Sounds familiar. Expand Social Security, more public housing. Low-income housing was funded with tax dollars. Oh, and my gosh, a national health insurance program and civil rights legislation. We're going to focus more on the civil rights legislation here at this point in time because it is brewing. The Holocaust really helped bring more thoughts and questioning about, how people are treated not only in the world but in American society, and it's going to help fuel the civil rights movement at home. Remember the Double V campaign, right? That's going to continue on in the 1940s. And Truman is going to push for civil rights, and he is going to establish a commission called the Presidential Committee of Civil Rights, and he's going to say, go out there, do some research, give me a report on your recommendations and what the country looks like and what's needed to establish a more equitable society. And they come up with a report called To Secure These Rights in 1947. They're going to say that everybody has the right to safety and security, there's right to citizenship and its privileges, there's a right to equality of opportunity, and there's a right to a freedom of conscious expression in a society that is necessary, but of course it's not really there for everybody. And so they are going to call for desegregation. The federal government needs to push for this. Anti-lynching laws, we've talked about this before, and an end to poll taxes. People should not have to pay in order to vote. This is limiting lower income people, which tends to be largely the minority class. Desegregation, anti-lynching laws, end to poll taxes. On top of that, an end to literacy tests, right? This is significantly, those last two are significantly causing a disenfranchisement of people. Note at this point in time, the first African American breaks into the professional baseball league here at that time. The owner signs Jackie Robinson. Look at that film 42 if you get a chance. There was also a breakthrough in the NFL later on the next year, I believe, if not the year before. So Truman is going to push civil rights legislation and that all people receive equal rights, no discrimination, right? And so this is going to be part of his Fair Deal program. Now, there is going to be a bit of a pushback on this. I wonder who that would be or where it would come from. Largely the South, right? So he is going to do some work on his own as Commander-in-Chief. Truman is going to desegregate the military. The Korean War will see soldiers fighting side by side in integrated units. That had not happened since the Revolutionary War. But the South and Southern Democrats are going to, sorry for the crazy visual there, they are going to push back. And two key leaders here, Strom Thurmond and a guy by the name of Wallace, are going to say, Truman, who was a farmer at one point in time, with his donkey pulling the plow, is going in his direction of civil rights and civil rights legislation reform. And one of the signals for the donkey is G, turn right, or Haw, turn left. Mr. Truman, you're not going in the right direction, right? You need to steer the party and the Democratic Party in a different direction. Well, he's stubborn as a mule, he would admit, and he would not change his position on civil rights. And so the Democratic Party experiences a split. These two particular individuals will help form the Dixiecrats, right? They leave the Democratic Party because of this civil rights program, but also because of, right, and it's not just this, it's also because of New Deal type programs and an expansion of big federal government that is going to start changing our political map, right? Our map is going to change colors here very soon. So Truman does decide to run for election in 1948. His wife was not very happy about that. She was not in Washington, D.C. very much. But the election is in doubt because the party is split. His opponent here is the Republican Thomas Dewey, who in all the polls seemed to be leading by a wide margin. It was not looking very good for this election bid for his own term in office. The Chicago Tribune actually printed a premature headline saying that Dewey won, but it was premature. The numbers weren't all in, and as you can see in the South, shades moving toward red. That orange states' rights party, the Dixiecrats, do steal some votes from Truman, but it's not enough. Kind of riding maybe a little bit on the coattails of FDR here yet. He does eke out the win, and it's a very narrow margin here. So his election in this particular year also sees the Congress going back to Democratic control, and his fair deal will pass in terms of more Social Security, expansion of Social Security, some housing programs for low-income people, largely in inner cities and urban areas, and a increase in the minimum wage. Today's minimum wage federally hasn't increased, I don't think, since the 1970s, somewhere in there. So this is going to be a trend that we'll see amongst Democratic and Republican presidents. There will be an expansion of Social Security and minimum wage generally throughout these next couple decades. If you're interested in going to the Keys, you might go stop and see the little White House. This is where Truman spent a lot of time. That was his time away spot. Second essential question for us here today is the response of Americans and the U.S. government to the threat of communism at home. One of the popular things going on here at the time in the film and movie industry and in books were there was this fascination and themes and plots that were surrounding aliens, right? Aliens coming from outer space. It was that kind of a sense that Americans had with communism, that they were coming into the country and they were somehow living amongst us in this atomic age as well. Something that was similar to it, there was a Red Scare before the World War II, post-World War II era, right? We are in Red Scare Part 2. In the pre-war time period, there was a bit of a scare in a remake and a revamping of a book called The War of the Worlds by Orson Welles on radio, and people actually thought it was a invasion in a few places of the country. That was an invasion of aliens in the United States, and there was a little bit of chaos here and there. There was actually some congressional hearings about that. What was your intent with that, sir? All that kind of thing. But this was a theme, and the theme is kind of represented in our fears of communism at the time, aliens. And of course, we're starting to move into space here a little bit. So some of the causes, right? There have been a lot of events that have been behind this. The Berlin airlift in 1948. We could add in there Czechoslovakia fell to communism in 1948. The Klaus Fuchs spy case, 1949. The Soviets get the atomic bomb in 1949. China falls to communism in 1949. And in 1950, the North Koreans invade South Korea. And so there's a great amount of fear of communist subversion and sabotage here. There are military power. Now in 1949 they have the atomic bomb and all of that kind of thing, and that there are spies living amongst us, right? There's this great iceberg, and of course an iceberg is very big on top, but it's much bigger down below the surface. You know, how big really is it? How vast is the communist conspiracy or the element in America? Well, one of the things that gets established here is under the Truman administration, with criticism for not being tough enough on communism and communists in the country, he does establish an executive order called the Loyalty Order 9835, the Executive Loyalty Program, and it orders federal employee investigations and or interviews. The Federal Employee Loyalty Program is conducted. There are loyalty committees that are established in every federal agency. The FBI is involved here. People are asked questions. Who do you know? Are you a member of the Communist Party? Do you know anybody who is a member of the Communist Party? Many people lose their jobs or resign under this kind of a pressure. People are forced to sign loyalty oaths, as you can kind of see one right here, especially teachers, because that liberal communist ideology, we don't want that in our schools, and our kids to be taught all of that. And government employees are forbidden a good deal of things, right? Some things that are kind of shocking in a way, to say the least. So there is this going on from the executive branch. Now, within the Congress, there had been formed in 1938, before World War II, in our first Red Scare, an investigative committee called HUAC. in short. The House Un-American Activities Committee is going to interview people and call to people to testify before Congress about their connections to communism, right? And this is going back to, events right after World War I that we've talked about in the past, right? And concerns about communist subversion. One of the famous groups that were interrogated by the HUAC committee was the Hollywood 10. Some workers and executive directors and screenwriters from Hollywood. Some of them were Jewish. Many of them were Jewish in background and such. And it was considered that maybe some of those producers and writers and Jewish leaders within the industry had sympathies that leaned toward communism or extreme socialism. Many of them took the Fifth Amendment, refused to testify about their political beliefs, believing it was unconstitutional, infringed on their rights, and for that they went to jail for a period of time. But most of them all were blacklisted from jobs in the film industry. Basically, that means a list is created and it's passed around amongst leaders in the film industry, and if those particular individuals want to get a job there and their name is on a list, you're not getting a job. Nancy Davis, the wife of Ronald Reagan, was famous for being on famous because she was an actress, but before they married, she wrote a note or made a phone call to Ronald Reagan, who was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, the union for actors and screenwriters, and saying, help get me out of this particular blacklist. It's killing me. And so he does help her with that, and eventually they get married. All right. Ronald Reagan is a famous actor. Check out Bedtime for Bonzo. Another example of spies amongst us is the Alger Hiss case. There is he's a Department of State employee who was, before the war, accused of, and after this time was accused of, before the war, passing information to a person, Whittaker Chambers, who was an admitted communist, and passing information off to the Soviet Union. Before and after the World War II. He was convicted by Congress of perjury, lying under oath, and he went to prison for 5 years. The leader of this HUAC committee, one of the key leaders, is our future President Richard Nixon. He gets a very big name made for himself in hunting down these particular communists that are undermining our society. The other famous spy case here that occurs is the Rosenberg spy case. They're convicted of espionage and of having given atomic bomb information to the Soviet Union or technology that is connected to it in some way. Julius was an electrical engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers. His wife was not connected to a government job as far as I understand it, and I might be wrong with that, but essentially they're sending information is the accusation against them to the Soviets here with all this. He's convicted under the 1917 Espionage Act and executed by electric chair, both of them, right? Now this might be very familiar to you in terms of another case in which the electric chair was used in the 1920s. Let's see if you remember that. It was in recent times with a review of the case that the evidence being very shaky, especially against his wife. She didn't know anything about any of all this. So the case, like some previous cases in times of hysteria, have resulted in decisions that are dire and wrong. And in this particular case, it's pretty much judged that the execution punishment is way over the top compared to what they did. So in times of national security, civil rights, civil liberties can be, again, at risk here with all of this. And then comes in our Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, the great Republican from Wisconsin, who is the name and the face of the hysteria of the 1950s, right? And this would be a word you would want to write down: hysteria about communism and communist subversion. He's a senator who testifies before the Senate and makes a speech before the Senate in 1950 saying there are 205 communists who are card-carrying members of the Communist Party who work in the United States Department of State. Right? This is the agency that has diplomats throughout the world and relationships with countries throughout the world and form and carry out our foreign policy. And so because of this, the Senate launches a set of investigative hearings that are going to last over the next several years. This is going to be very similar to and will be literally a witch hunt like the Salem witch trials of the 17th century. If you've seen the film or read the book, Arthur Miller's A Crucible, the same kind of situation is here in what develops finger pointing, accusations made with faked documentation, elaborate maps, faked letters, doctored photos, things of that nature, but still coming up with not a lot of hardcore proof or evidence, if any at all. Eventually it gets put on television, people watch it live throughout the country, and again, this is whipping everybody up and causing hysteria amongst everybody. And it kind of comes to a head when McCarthy starts to accuse the top generals in the Pentagon of being members of the Communist Party. And at that point in time, people start to say, this guy is a little over the top, to say the least, and it falls apart. He eventually is going to be censured. Come to that in a second. A response to all this, in the middle of all this, notice the date 1952, Congress passes the McCarran Act, and it requires communists to register with the government and to give documentation about their meetings if they have a communist organization and things like that. And it's a response to all of this stuff and the McCarthy claim as well. And the president could essentially arrest those deemed suspicious, right? Not convicted of doing anything necessarily, but suspicious. Truman vetoes it, saying it's too much presidential power. Congress overrides it easily in both houses, and Truman says this is the greatest danger to freedom of speech. Press and assembly since the Alien and Sedition Laws of 1798, a mockery of the Bill of Rights and a long step toward totalitarianism, right? So it's passed anyway, and so it's a example of, the sentiment of Congress, which is, I guess, the sentiment of the people in the country. So these McCarthy hearings haven't been televised. It really ruins the lives of a lot of people. Guilt by association is the case in a lot of these hearings in the Senate and the House with HUAC. The Senate is going to vote to censor him for misconduct. The Republican Party and even the president at the time, toward the latter part of the years here of this event, Eisenhower really didn't do a lot to shut McCarthy down and kind of let it happen. But eventually the Senate does take action, and this whole event spawns a new phrase called McCarthyism. You've perhaps heard it recently. It basically becomes known as any kind of a campaign or a promise. Excuse me, sorry here, things are moving back and forth. Any kind of a campaign or practice that endorses the use of unfair allegations and investigations, right? Creating hysteria, rising hysteria here, and with the McCarthy hearings and HUAC and this Red Scare, right? The bucket could be any of those particular organizations we just talked about, or the McCarran Act, trying to throw water on what is called a fire, but essentially perhaps we are hurting our own civil liberties and civil rights in the process. Going a little bit too far. So, domestic response to the Red Scare. Examples there. I had one more in there, the Smith Act. You can kind of look that up. Things woven in there in terms of events going on. It doesn't end with the end of McCarthy. It really continues on throughout the 50s and into the 1960s, but the early part of the 50s were the height of it. Your left side is just a simple mind map like this. That's all you've really got to do in terms of what's going on in our politics and society, and that'll be the day. Here's another chart for you to take a look at. You can go ahead and take a snapshot of it to kind of add to that chart. Have a good day. Keep making the hay.